Certainly, I am grateful for the opportunity to share with you again. I'm grateful that you're here, that you've spent the day focusing on formation and spirituality and hopefully gaining new perspectives or soul care or whatever it is that the Lord led you to do in coming here and participate in while you were here. Just grateful that you have that opportunity, and I know we're really glad to have you on campus, and we're glad to have Chris Miller around. He's really been a great joy to get to know Chris and to see what God is doing through him. So we appreciate him very much. And just so many who bring this together, just grateful for all of them. This afternoon, I want to focus on forgiveness as a theme in the shack. It kind of lies low early on, but it emerges at the end as kind of a critical factor for Mac's healing. If you remember toward the end of the story, Papa, who now appears in the form of a male figure, takes Mac to the place where Missy's body is. And there's a moment, there's a scene in both the movie and the book where basically it's like that one last thing, Mac. You've come a long way, but there's one last thing. It almost kind of echoes the rich young ruler scene, doesn't it? You've come this far, but one thing you lack. And it's sort of forgiveness then becomes at the end of the shack this moment of wholeness. Because without forgiveness, there's always still a wound. Without forgiveness, the wound still festers in some way. So even though Mac had come to that moment where he had renewed trust in God, in the scene in the cave, here comes the Judge chapter, where he experiences Missy. And in that moment, he comes back from the cave and he embraces Papa. And, he's just so full of joy, and trust has been renewed in that moment. But it's not over. It's not over. Because Matt still needs to learn to forgive. And I think that's where we find ourselves in so many places in our spiritual formation. That there are those moments of forgiveness that we yet lack. And I see in the book as a whole 3 levels of forgiveness. And I don't know whether to call them levels. I want to talk about them as they're kind of integrated. They're deeply connected with one another. That is, one leads to the other, and the other leads to the other. And then they come back around, and it's almost a reciprocal relationship, a transformative development or growth into the life of forgiveness. And it's whether we forgive others or how we learn to forgive ourselves or how we learn to forgive God. That those 3 notions are intricately connected. And as we grow deeper in one, then the other is more open to us as well. But we can't really talk about them in that kind of Venn diagram kind of way. It's hard to do that. So we're going to have to take one at a time, basically. Because we can only kind of do it linearly here, in a linear way. But let me indicate what I think is at the root that enables all 3. At the root is an understanding and a way of being that embraces forgiveness as a participation in the divine life. Let me say that again. Forgiveness is a way of being that participates in the divine life. And the more deeply we are participants in the divine life, the more comfortable we are in the presence of God and sitting at the table with God, the more formed we are into the sort of people who can forgive. Forgive others, forgive ourselves, and yes, even forgive God. And it's from that kind of root standpoint that I want to talk about those three dimensions of forgiveness and try to relate them all back to that root notion. And it's almost kind of like which comes first, the horse or the cart, or, it's hard to say, okay, you got to do this first and then you can do this. I don't know that it works that way. It seems to me it's much more complex than that it's much more dynamic than that it's more reciprocal, that it's more about a growth dynamic or a spiral into the life of God. That as we grow deeper in one, we grow deeper in the other, and we grow deeper in the other, and we are able then to more fully display and more fully live out a life of forgiveness. So let me start with forgiving others. Because I'm going to tell you, in my experience, as hard as it is to forgive others, it's much easier than the other two. I don't know. It would be nice to maybe do a cell phone poll here, and we'd find out, because I don't want to raise a hand, because everybody looks around. Okay. Yeah, I think I will. Much more honest, and found in my classes it's much more honest to have a cell phone poll, because then on the cell phone they'll tell you anything, right? That's as long as they don't know who it's coming from. But I don't know for you which is more difficult, to forgive yourself or to forgive someone else. So let's start with forgiving others. I remember early on in my recovery, I went to a 12-step meeting, and they had the big book. It was a big book study, and they had it open, and they were talking about resentments. And this is very early on, within the first couple of weeks of my attending 12-step meetings. And it was a book study, and the topic was resentment. And I was sitting there thinking, resentment? And these guys were all talking about their resentments, and I'm thinking, I don't have any resentments. And that was my first thought, and I sat there and trying to think, what do I resent? And finally I made a statement. I shared that it was difficult for me to think about resentments and I can't identify any resentments. And as in a good 12-step meeting, nobody said, you're an idiot. Nobody said that. But that's what I was at the moment, because basically I just didn't know myself. I remember one of the first times I went to therapy in my recovery, my shack was so sealed, and it was concretized, I had this nice thick wall that nobody could get into my shack, because I didn't want to be in my shack. It hurt too much to be in my shack. When I go to my shack, that hurts. And I learned early on that I don't want to go there. So I erected all kinds of walls so that I don't go there. Right? Well, I remember in one of my first therapy sessions, my therapist said to me, "You are well defended." And I can fight off anything so that it doesn't get to my shack. And that's what was happening in that meeting about resentments. And over a period of time, I began to learn about myself. Yeah, I got a lot of resentments. And resentment is that core feeling, attitude, perspective that hinders forgiveness. Because resentment is that sort of thing that we feel deep inside that is a matter of self-justification. I justify myself. Right? And I build up all kinds of rationales within my own psyche and in my own heart to say something negative about the other person or about the experience I had with them. And resentment gives me the rationale for either ignoring, dumping on, judging, or simply refusing to acknowledge. Resentment is that sort of thing that's in our soul that erects a barrier towards forgiveness. Because resentment says basically something like, for me to forgive you, you have to justify yourself or something of that nature. You have to come up to my level. You have to own it. You have to do something to relieve the justified feeling of resentment I have toward you. Because when we resent, we always feel good in our resentments. We always feel right in our resentments. We always feel justified in our resentments. They deserve that. I'm not talking to them because, here we go. And resentment then is a wall that prevents us from participating in the divine life. And when we erect that wall, it is hard to get to participate in God's life. It's hard to commune in God's life. It's hard to sit in the presence of God when we are filled with resentments toward other people. Resentment is, as is commonly said in the rooms, it's a poison we ingest, hoping the other person will die. In other words, our failure to forgive, our sense of resentment is a way in which, or it becomes a cancer that eats away our own life. It eats away our serenity. It eats away our security. And we make ourselves miserable. Doesn't do anything to the other person, right? It just kills us. So forgiveness, it seems to me, and what I think you see in the shack in various ways, is that forgiveness is about letting go. One of those old standby sayings, right? Let go and let God. Letting go. Letting go of my own sense of self-justification. Letting go of my own sense of need to strangle the other person. Right? Letting go of vengeance. Letting go of a sense of justice. Now, that doesn't mean that what the other person did was right or that there should not be appropriate anger. I mean, it's appropriate to be angry at the one who sexually abused you. It's appropriate to be angry at the one who murdered your child. We're not talking about the appropriateness of anger here. We're talking about a path of healing where resentment is a barrier to that path. At some point, we learn to let go. Or as the Shack puts it, you might remember it from a scene in the movie as well, to learn to let go of the throat of the other person. You let go and let God. So forgiveness is about participating in the divine life in the sense of allowing God to handle the justice. Let God handle the vengeance, whatever that is. Let God handle the outcome. We let go so God can do God's work in that person. And one way to experience this, and those who have been in the rooms have probably heard this many times, that one way to experience this, of course, is that the person that I'm resenting is the person I need to pray for. To learn to pray daily for the person whom you resent or I resent. And to pray a prayer that embodies the very life of God and participates in the life of God. And that is a prayer for the other's sake. Not a prayer for my sake. Although it will have a healing movement in my heart, that when I pray for the other, it releases the toxicity, it releases the vengeance, it releases the anger, the inappropriate anger toward that other person. And when I pray for the other, then I am participating in the life of God, because this is who God is. God is the one who became human for the other. God is the one who pours out God's life for the other. God is the one who creates for the other. That God is this other-centered love. And when we participate in that love, we love the other, care for the other, pray for the other. So, in my practices, I have on occasion prayed daily for the one I resented. And I don't think there's a timetable to that. Some suggest do it for 30 days. Some suggest do it for however long it takes. Until you come to some sense of letting go of the resentment. See, forgiveness is not owed. Forgiveness is given. When we have the attitude, they must do something before I forgive. They must make up this before I forgive. They must make amends before I forgive. Then it's a matter of just self-justification. But forgiveness is a gift we give to the other. And it's a gift we give to ourselves. Because when we can forgive and participate in the life of God, and we let go of the resentment, then we can be free of the shackles that bind us. And we can get rid of the poison that's in our veins because of that resentment. But forgiving ourselves is, in my experience, much more difficult. Some people think that to talk about forgiving yourself is more a kind of pop psychology. It's more, maybe it's more related to the hurt. That it's really it's not really a biblical notion. But I think of self-forgiveness as more along the lines of self-love. That we are called to care for our souls, right? We are called to pay attention to our own journey and our own soul and our own life. So I think self-forgiveness is a function of self-love and self-care. Now, self-forgiveness can become a function of just our own self-righteousness. When we subvert the forgiving dimension of it and just kind of go on with ourselves, right? And not really deal with ourselves. We can forgive ourselves in a very flippant way, saying, oh, well, we're all sinners, it doesn't matter, and we can move on. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the experience of when we fully recognize the evil in which we have participated, or the evil we have committed, and we know it's out of sync with who we are and our identity. It's out of sync with our direction and our intention. This is not the kind of person we want to be. And when we find ourselves there, there's a tendency to beat ourselves up, to annihilate ourselves. We move into not only self-pity, we move into self-hatred, and we begin to think of ourselves as unworthy of love. I'm getting what I deserve. And we find it hard to be grateful. We are grateful, but we find it hard to be grateful for others who forgive us because we haven't forgiven ourselves. I don't deserve it. And it's almost as if our lack of self-forgiveness is a way of punishing ourselves. And it's a way of, well, let me put it this way. I think it's a function of pride. I remember talking about this with someone on occasion, and I was telling her that I was having a very difficult time forgiving myself. I knew better. This is not who I am, but I did it anyway. And I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. And so I just talking with her about that struggle. And she responded in this way. And she asked me a question that was very illuminating for me. And she says, do you believe God has forgiven you? Yeah, you know. Certainly at some level, I believe that. You know, it's something I embrace. And then she asked, well, do you know something about yourself that God doesn't? I mean, is there some part of your life you got hidden from God that God says you are worthy of love and God's forgiveness is upon you and God's embrace and yet you want to pull back a little bit and say, well, if God really knew me, then he wouldn't forgive me. Right? That there is that part of you that God doesn't really accept because you don't accept yourself. And what she was getting at for me was that my refusal, you might say, to forgive myself was actually a function of my pride. I was still living in a pride that said, I don't deserve forgiveness. I'm not worthy of forgiveness. I'm not worthy of love. And that was a reverse sense of pride. See, that kind of toxic shame and pride, they're kind of two sides of the same coin. think it was within a couple of days of that. Well, I tell you, take it back. I had a small group, and somewhere in that context, the small group also asked me that question, and I just couldn't see it. You know, pride. It was more of a prideful thing to beat myself up. I mean, I felt, as weird as this sounds, it felt good to beat myself up. Right? That felt like what really belonged. And my small group was encouraging me to forgive myself. And I think it was a couple of days after that I started in the morning looking myself in the mirror. I do that once a day when I comb my hair. The rest of the time I don't. When I look in the mirror and I say, I forgive you. I can't tell you how long it took me to actually believe that. But that practice, I forgive you. What enables that sense of forgiveness? It seems to me it is about participating in the life of God. It's part of the Lord's Prayer, which is a formative practice for me. That not only do we forgive others, but we forgive ourselves, right? And we ask God to forgive us as we have forgiven others and as we forgive. I think we can add ourselves. But lying at the root, in some sense, of all of that is the struggle to forgive God. Now that's not very common language in the Christian tradition, but it is common language in the Jewish tradition. To forgive God. Now, that language does not mean, and hear me clearly, okay? It doesn't mean forgive God of the sins God has committed. Right? It's not saying, okay, God has done something evil, and so God needs forgiveness. It's more about how we relate to God in the context of our woundedness and our brokenness, that we blame God and we're angry with God and we wonder why God didn't do something different, and we feel a sense of resentment toward God, that God didn't do something different. And it's in that kind of sense that I'm thinking here about forgiving God. It's part of that dialogue with God and that lament with God, that questioning of God, the why and the how long and why don't you do something, and you didn't do something. Why not? And it builds up that kind of resentment about God's actions or failure to act. It's what you see in the shack. It's what is bothering Mac all the way through the shack. Why weren't you there? Why didn't you hinder that? Why didn't you stop that? Remember, Papa says, I never left her. Right? Papa even says at one point, it could have been different. And so that struggle with the why question, that struggle with the blame, that struggle with the resentment, I think that can be at the root of a lot of our failure to forgive others and even to forgive ourselves. Because fundamentally, it's a failure or a lack, I don't want to say failure, I want to say lack, a lack of trust that God truly loves us. Because it's what the woundedness does to us, right? The woundedness, and however that wound may come, God, why did you let that happen to me? God, why did you let that abuser treat me that way? God, why did you let my child die? You know, all those questions address a sense of whether I trust that God can love me even in the midst of these tragic circumstances. That God can be present in the tragedies in ways that transcend my capacity to understand. But they don't make sense to me. From where I sit, there's no rhyme or reason to this. And so what we have to do in our struggles, what happens, it seems to me, is that we struggle with these questions that create the doubts, and the wounds then fester. And as those doubts arise, we have a hard time maintaining a sense of God's goodness in our lives, a sense of God's goodness in the midst of the tragedy. And we resent God. Because it could have been different. And that, for me, is the most basic resentment of all. And I wonder if that's not why the shack deals with that resentment first. Because if one can deal with that resentment, if one can let go of that resentment and open oneself up to the participating in the love of God, experiencing the love of God in that triune relationship, in the sitting at the table with God, if one can learn to trust that God is good and at the same time recognize that I am not in a position to be God's judge, that God has a grand purpose, which the story of God tells, that within this grand purpose, my great sadness is part of the tapestry of God's providence. Now, I'm not suggesting God causes anything. It's just part of the providence. It's there. To accept the tapestry of God's providence is to recognize that God's purposes and what God is doing is beyond what I can fathom. And so I either have this choice, I don't know if it's an either or, but it's certainly a choice between becoming God's judge and resenting God, constantly resenting God, and then as I resent God, that becomes a cancer in my soul that enables me to resent others more easily as well. So I can choose to go down that path of resentment, or I can choose another path. A path of humility that recognizes I don't know everything. That basically says on the bottom line, I'm not God. You are. And because you are God and I am not, you know stuff that I don't know. You are weaving a story that I can't weave. You have a purpose that I can't see into in every way. But what you have done in your story is assure to me that you are love and that you have loved me. There are perhaps many reasons to doubt God. And there may be many reasons to resent God. But they pale. They pale in the light of the story that God has enacted. See, I can stand at the grave of my wife and doubt God's love and goodness. Been there, done that. But it's very difficult for me to kneel at the cross and doubt God's love. We have reason to trust because of what God has done in Jesus Christ. We have reason to trust. And I trust in the God who is greater than I, more than I, whose grand purpose and whose sovereign will has the capacity to weave a tapestry of beauty, even though it has dark lines in it. It's part of what that garden was about, right? The garden in the shack that has a deep wound in it. The wound needs healing, but as it heals, when you look at the image of the garden, it has red and it has yellow and it has blue, but it also has some dark. It's part of what makes the beauty of a life. It's part of what suffering does for us. It makes us into a tapestry of beauty. I remember December 2008, Jennifer and I attended a middle school talent show. 3-hour middle school talent show. The kind of show you only go to when you have kids or grandkids there, right? And I remember sitting there about 30 minutes into it, and I started getting a little antsy. You know, my first thought, okay, I've had enough of this, you know. And but it was more than just antsy. I was disturbed. You know, there was something inside me that was just frustrated with this, you know. And I think at the previous time in my life, I would have taken that and said, yeah, this isn't worth it. Let's get out of here, you know. And I would have probably found some excuse to leave. I would have lied and said, hey, I need to do this and gone, you know. But I decided I would just sit there for a little bit. And I would look inside my soul to take this moment to go within myself, you know, and find out what was really bothering me. Was it, you know, what I found out was I was bothered by, by envy. I was envious of these parents all around me. Because I never got to see my son do anything like that. And then it quickly went from envy to judgment. And these parents don't have a clue how blessed they are. You know? Boy, if they had had my experience, they would really be able to take this in and enjoy it, even as bad as they are. Enjoy it, you know. Envy to judgment to resentment. I resented those parents. And then, as I looked more deeply, I recognized I resented God. Because I never had the opportunity to see my son sing a song. or act in a play. I never saw my son color between the lines. And I resented that. I'm grateful for the gift of being able to see within myself. Because years before, I wouldn't have been able to see that. And once I could see, not that I see in myself all the time, certainly not, but in that moment I could see what was going on, that I resented God. And once I saw what it was, then I could do something with that. Right? I could let go of the envy, and I could let go of the judgment, and I could take my resentment to God. I think that's what Mac had to do ultimately, was let go of that resentment. And what allowed him to let go of that resentment was to actually participate in the life of God. I think that's the great point of the shack. That wounds are healed. People are forgiven. We are released from our own self-hatred. When we can actually see ourselves, envision ourselves, and participate in the communion of the Father, Son, and Spirit, to experience the joy of their relationship and the joy that they have, that God has in welcoming us. That scene when Mac walks into the shack. You remember when he was in the shack before, he hated God. He said, "I hate you." You know? But when he walked into the shack the second time, he became a part of a community where love overwhelmed hatred, where love subverted resentment, where love was a great joy. Seems to me that we will not be able to deal with our resentments and the burdens of our hearts until we can sit at the table with God, secure in the knowledge that God is especially fond of us. And if I can sit there, I can let go of the throat of other people. And I can let go of my own throat. And I can let go of God's throat. And trust that the one who loves me has a grand purpose that I don't understand, but is for my sake. It's for my sake. Glory to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen.